They burned synagogues. They destroyed Torah scrolls. They erased entire communities. But some books were not burned. Instead, they were sealed, cataloged, studied. Inside the offices of the SS, there existed a quiet obsession, a belief that the Jewish people possessed something far more dangerous than weapons. Knowledge, not political power, not economic influence, but hidden laws of reality. Members of the SS believed that Jewish mysticism, known as Kabbalah, contained secrets capable of shaping destiny itself. That words, symbols, and divine names could bend the world in ways science could not explain. This fear did not lead to understanding. It led to theft. While millions were being murdered, their sacred texts were confiscated and delivered to Nazi researchers, not to preserve them, but to dissect them. The Third Reich sought to build a new world. But first, it wanted to understand the old one, especially the parts it could not control. This is the story of how the SS tried to destroy Jewish mysticism and why they secretly believed it was real. When the world imagines the ideology of Nazi Germany, it often sees cold efficiency, bureaucracy, uniforms, rail schedules, factories of death. What is less understood, and deliberately obscured by the regime itself, is that at the core of the SS, there existed a deep conviction that reality was governed by invisible laws, not merely economic forces or military strength, but hidden structures of meaning that could be decoded, mastered, and weaponized. This belief did not emerge on the fringes. It sat at the heart of the Schutzstaffel, especially among its leadership. To the SS, history was not random. Victory and defeat were not accidents. The world, they believed, followed ancient patterns, symbols, bloodlines, names, and myths that preceded modern civilization. And if those patterns could be understood, the future could be controlled. By the mid-1930s, the SS had evolved far beyond a security force. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler, it became an ideological order, part political elite, part cult. Himmler openly rejected the Enlightenment belief that rationalism alone explained human history. In his private correspondence and internal SS speeches, he repeatedly mocked what he called soulless materialism. He believed instead in destiny. Himmler was convinced that Germany's collapse after World War I was not simply military or economic, but spiritual. The German people, he argued, had been severed from their ancestral sources of power. Christianity, liberalism, and modern science had stripped Europe of its mythic core. The task of the SS was not only to conquer territory, but to restore a cosmic order in which Germany ruled by historical and metaphysical right. This obsession explains why the SS invested enormous resources in areas that, on the surface, seemed irrational. Between 1935 and 1945, the SS funded dozens of research programs that had no immediate military value: expeditions to Tibet, studies of runic symbols, investigations into ancient burial rites, and the systematic collection of religious manuscripts. These projects were not symbolic gestures. They were treated as strategic assets. The assumption was simple and terrifying: knowledge itself was power. Within this worldview, the Jewish people were not perceived merely as a racial or political enemy. They were imagined as custodians of an ancient, hidden system, a rival cosmology that threatened Nazi claims to destiny. Nazi propaganda portrayed Jews as weak, parasitic, and degenerate. But internal SS documents tell a different story. In private, SS ideologues described Jews as dangerous precisely because they had survived. Survival, in their thinking, implied access to something beyond ordinary understanding. How, they asked, could a people without land, without armies, without political sovereignty endure for thousands of years? The answer, in SS logic, was not culture or resilience. It was secret knowledge. Jewish mysticism, particularly Kabbalah, was framed as a code, a system of symbols, numbers, and divine names that allegedly allowed its practitioners to influence fate. This belief had no grounding in authentic Jewish theology, but accuracy was irrelevant. What mattered was perception. To the SS, Kabbalah represented the ultimate threat, a metaphysical weapon they did not control. This paranoia was not limited to a few eccentric officers. It became institutionalized through the creation of specialized research bodies. Most notorious among them was the ahnenerbe, founded in 1935. Officially, the ahnenerbe existed to study German ancestral heritage. In practice, it functioned as an SS think tank dedicated to uncovering what Himmler called Urwissen, primordial knowledge. Its departments investigated everything from ancient languages to ritual practices. One division focused on religious texts, deemed hostile but significant. Jewish writings, especially mystical and esoteric ones, were flagged for collection rather than destruction. By 1939, as Germany expanded eastward, SS units were accompanied by archivists and scholars. When cities fell, they did not only seize gold or art, they seized books. Libraries in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and later occupied Soviet territories were stripped. Synagogues were looted with surgical precision. Torah scrolls were often desecrated publicly, but manuscripts labeled mystical, esoteric, or occult were quietly shipped to SS archives. The contradiction was deliberate. The SS wanted the Jewish world erased, but not its secrets lost. By the end of 1942, SS-controlled repositories held tens of thousands of confiscated Jewish texts. Precise figures are difficult to establish, but post-war Allied inventories give a glimpse of the scale. Over 20,000 religious manuscripts cataloged in SS storage facilities. Thousands of books transferred to research centers linked to the ahnenerbe. Entire private libraries seized intact, especially those belonging to rabbis and scholars. These were not random seizures. Each text was indexed, labeled, and classified according to perceived value. Works related to mysticism were separated from legal or philosophical writings. Kabbalistic diagrams, commentaries on the Zohar, and texts discussing divine names were given special attention. The SS did not understand these writings, but they believed someone eventually would. One of the most revealing aspects of SS interest in Jewish mysticism was its fixation on language. Himmler and his inner circle believed words were not neutral tools, but carriers of power. Names, especially, were thought to contain essence. This belief aligned perfectly with their distorted understanding of Kabbalah, which they imagined as a system where uttering or inscribing certain names could alter reality. SS researchers attempted to map Jewish mystical symbols onto their own runic system, searching for parallels that might unlock what they called activation principles. These efforts were clumsy and incoherent. Scholars involved lacked training in Hebrew, Aramaic, or Jewish theology. But incompetence did not diminish conviction. If anything, misunderstanding intensified fear. What they could not decode, they assumed was deliberately concealed. To ignore Jewish mysticism would have meant accepting that Jewish survival was human, not supernatural. That was unacceptable to Nazi ideology. The regime required its enemies to be monstrous in order to justify their annihilation. Thus, Kabbalah became a convenient myth. It allowed the SS to frame genocide not merely as racial purification, but as a cosmic struggle. In this imagined war, destroying Jewish bodies was not enough. Jewish knowledge had to be neutralized, studied, and ultimately controlled. This is why the SS never fully trusted book burnings. Flames destroyed paper, but not ideas. And ideas, in their worldview, were far more dangerous than weapons. Here lies the central contradiction of the SS obsession with hidden knowledge. They believed Jews were inferior, They believed Jews possessed immense power. They sought to annihilate them. They sought to steal their secrets. This paradox was not a flaw. It was the engine of SS ideology. Hatred fed fear. Fear justified obsession. Obsession demanded control. And control required knowledge. By the early years of the war, the SS was no longer simply fighting enemies on the battlefield. It was fighting an invisible war against texts, symbols, prayers, and ideas it barely understood but deeply feared. In the next chapter, we will examine what Kabbalah actually is and why the SS's interpretation of it was not only wrong, but fundamentally revealing of their own mindset. Because the greatest secret the SS never understood was this: the power they feared was never hidden in the books. It was hidden in their own belief that knowledge could be owned. To the men of the SS, Kabbalah appeared as something ancient, secretive, and dangerously abstract. They imagined it as a coded weapon system, a manual for bending reality through symbols and divine names. But this image was not only false, it revealed far more about Nazi thinking than about Jewish mysticism itself. Kabbalah was never designed to control the world. It was designed to understand it. At its core, Kabbalah is a mystical tradition within Judaism that seeks to explore the relationship between God, creation, and the human soul. It emerged gradually between late antiquity and the medieval period, drawing on earlier biblical interpretation, rabbinic thought, and philosophical reflection. Its most influential text, the Zohar, appeared in 13th century Spain, written in a stylized Aramaic, meant to echo ancient revelation. For centuries, Kabbalah was not popular mysticism. It was restricted knowledge. Traditionally, it was studied only by learned men over 40, already deeply grounded in Jewish law and ethics. The reason was simple. Without moral discipline and intellectual preparation, mystical concepts could be misunderstood or abused. Ironically, this warning proved prophetic. The SS encountered Kabbalah stripped of its context, torn from its ethical framework, and filtered through anti-Semitic fantasy. What they saw was not theology, but a projection of their own obsessions. Kabbalah does not claim that words magically alter reality by themselves. Its language is symbolic, not mechanistic. When it speaks of divine names, it does not mean incantations. It means states of consciousness, relationships between the human and the divine, ways of aligning intention with moral responsibility. The symbols are maps, not switches. This distinction was invisible to Nazi researchers. The SS worldview demanded domination. Every system of thought had to be evaluated by one question alone. Can it be weaponized? If not immediately, then potentially. Kabbalah, with its diagrams, numbers, and layered meanings, appeared to promise exactly what the SS craved: hidden levers beneath visible reality. The most famous of these diagrams is the Tree of Life, composed of 10 interconnected attributes, known as Sephirot. To Jewish mystics, these are not objects or forces, but aspects of divine emanation: mercy, judgment, wisdom, balance. The human task is not to command them, but to harmonize with them through ethical action. To the SS, however, the diagram looked like a control panel. SS analysts interpreted the Sephirot as nodes of power. They searched for correspondences between these attributes and their own ideological symbols: runes, bloodlines, cosmic cycles. They believed that if Jews had survived centuries of persecution, it must be because they had learned how to manipulate these invisible structures. This was a fundamental misreading. Jewish survival was not attributed by Jewish tradition to secret power, but to covenant, law, memory, and adaptation. Kabbalah does not promise victory. It explains suffering. It does not eliminate exile. It gives it meaning. That idea was incomprehensible to the SS. The Nazi mind rejected vulnerability. It despised weakness. A worldview built around endurance without domination was alien, and therefore suspicious. If Jews endured without power, then power must be hidden. This is why SS interest in Kabbalah intensified precisely as the genocide accelerated. As violence escalated, so did paranoia. The more Jews were stripped of rights, homes, and lives, the more irrational the fear became. What if something still protects them? Internal SS correspondence reveals repeated anxiety about curses, divine retribution, and metaphysical backlash. Some officers expressed concern that mass murder could provoke consequences beyond human understanding. Not punishment in a moral sense, but imbalance, disorder, a cosmic response. These fears were never expressed publicly. Nazi propaganda mocked Jewish religion as superstition. But internally, superstition flourished. The SS did not fear Jewish God as a moral authority. They feared him as a force. This distinction mattered. Morality could be rejected. Force had to be neutralized. As a result, Kabbalah was treated not as belief, but as technology. SS researchers dissected texts looking for operational principles. They cataloged diagrams, isolated repeated symbols, and attempted crude translations of Hebrew and Aramaic terms. They ignored commentaries, ethical discussions, and warnings embedded in the texts themselves. They were searching for access, not understanding. One recurring fixation was the concept of the divine name. In Jewish tradition, the name of God is not a tool. It is deliberately unpronounceable, representing the limits of human grasp. Kabbalistic writings emphasize restraint, humility, and danger in approaching it. The SS saw only potential. This misunderstanding was not accidental. It aligned perfectly with Nazi ideology, which treated human beings themselves as raw material. If bodies could be engineered, sterilized, or destroyed for a greater design, why not reality itself? Kabbalah became an SS imagination, proof that the universe was programmable, and that Jews had discovered the code first. This belief fed an internal narrative of theft and replacement. The Nazis did not want to destroy mysticism. They wanted to inherit it, to strip it of Jewish identity, and integrate it into a new racial cosmology where Germans, not Jews, stood at the center of the cosmic order. That project failed before it began. What the SS could not accept was the foundational premise of Kabbalah: that power without ethics is destructive, and knowledge without humility leads to collapse. These ideas were not peripheral, they were central. Every serious Kabbalistic text insists that misuse of mystical insight results not in mastery, but in fragmentation of the soul, the community, and the world. The SS dismissed such warnings as camouflage. In doing so, they revealed the true nature of their fear. They were not afraid that Kabbalah would save Jews. They were afraid it would judge them, not morally, but existentially. That it would expose their project as fundamentally unstable, out of alignment with the deeper structures of reality they believed existed. This fear explains the contradiction that puzzled even some Nazi officials. Why preserve the books of a people marked for extermination? Because destroying the people did not feel sufficient. The SS wanted certainty, assurance that nothing unseen could outlast the Reich. Studying Kabbalah was, in their minds, a way to peer behind the curtain, to make sure there was no higher order they could not conquer. They never found what they were looking for. Not because the texts hid secrets too well, but because the secrets they imagined were never there. Kabbalah did not promise control. It warned against the desire for it. And that warning was the one thing the SS could not read. In the next chapter, we will follow the trail of the stolen manuscripts themselves, where they were taken, who cataloged them, and what happened to this confiscated knowledge as the Third Reich began to collapse. Because while the SS failed to understand Kabbalah, they succeeded in something else, creating one of the largest thefts of sacred texts in modern history. And those books did not disappear with the Reich. The destruction of Jewish life in Europe unfolded in public. The destruction of Jewish knowledge did not. While synagogues burned and communities vanished, another operation advanced quietly in parallel. Systematic, bureaucratic, and deliberate. It was the theft of the sacred. As German forces moved across Central and Eastern Europe, specialized SS units followed close behind. Their task was not combat. It was collection. Books, scrolls, manuscripts, private libraries, anything that hinted at religious, philosophical, or mystical value was seized, sorted, and redirected. What could be displayed as humiliation was destroyed. What was perceived as dangerous was preserved. This was not random looting. It was policy. By 1938, months before the outbreak of full-scale war, the Schutzstaffel had already begun compiling lists of Jewish institutions deemed intellectually significant. These included major rabbinical seminaries, private collections belonging to respected scholars, and synagogues known to house rare manuscripts. The objective was not simply to erase Jewish culture, but to extract from it anything that might possess residual power. The paradox was chilling. The more the regime insisted Jews were inferior, the more obsessively it sought their books. In cities like Prague, Krakow, Warsaw, Vienna, and Vilnius, SS officers worked alongside archivists and linguists. Entire libraries were emptied in days. Shelves were photographed, contents cataloged, and crates stamped for transport. Torah scrolls were often desecrated or destroyed in public spectacles meant to terrorize. But texts labeled esoteric, mystical, or non-standard were separated out and spared. Those books were sent elsewhere. Many were routed through SS-controlled repositories, while others were transferred directly to research branches connected to the ahnenerbe. There, they were stored not as religious artifacts, but as data, fragments of an enemy system awaiting analysis. By the early 1940s, Nazi Germany controlled one of the largest stolen collections of Jewish texts in history. The scale of the operation only became clear after the war. Allied investigators discovered tens of thousands of confiscated books hidden in castles, monasteries, salt mines, and remote storage facilities. Among them were medieval manuscripts, handwritten commentaries, and rare Kabbalistic works that had survived centuries of persecution, only to be seized by a regime determined to erase their owners. The Nazis did not steal these books because they respected them. They stole them because they feared them. Internal SS memoranda reveal that Jewish mysticism was categorized as a hostile intellectual system. It was not treated as superstition, but as a rival worldview, one that had to be mapped, contained, and ultimately neutralized. Kabbalistic texts were flagged precisely because they were difficult to interpret. Complexity in SS thinking suggested depth. Depth suggested power. This logic drove the creation of dedicated archival projects. Jewish books were not simply piled together. They were indexed by subject, author, region, and perceived importance. Works dealing with mysticism, numerology, and divine names were often marked for special review. Some were translated partially, often poorly, by SS personnel with little linguistic training. Others were simply sealed away, preserved for a future in which, the SS believed, true decoding would be possible. The act of preservation was itself revealing. It exposed a fundamental anxiety at the heart of Nazi ideology, the fear that destroying people might not destroy what they believed in. Books have a way of outliving regimes. The SS understood this, perhaps more clearly than many of their enemies. That is why they sought not only to burn, but to possess, to make Jewish knowledge an object of state control, to strip it of its context and reframe it as a conquered resource. This was not unique to Jewish texts. The Nazis looted art, archives, and cultural artifacts across Europe. But religious manuscripts occupied a special category. art could be displayed, gold could be melted down. But sacred texts carried something less tangible: continuity. In Jewish tradition, knowledge is not centralized in a single authority. It is distributed, debated, transmitted across generations. That structure made it resilient. Even when communities were destroyed, texts survived elsewhere. The SS recognized this resilience and attempted to break it by centralizing what had always been dispersed. They wanted the books in one place, under one authority, under their authority. Yet, even in their own records, uncertainty persisted. SS researchers repeatedly complained that the materials were fragmentary, inaccessible, or lacking interpretive keys. They sensed meaning, but could not extract it. The texts resisted them, not through secrecy, but through indifference. They did not answer the questions the SS wanted to ask. Kabbalistic writings do not explain how to win wars or control populations. They explore suffering, exile, and moral responsibility. They speak of repair, not domination. This was profoundly frustrating to men searching for leverage. Some SS officials began to suspect that the power they sought could not be stolen, that it depended on a lived tradition, on language spoken within community, on study conducted with humility, on ethical constraints the Nazis categorically rejected. That suspicion only deepened their hostility. The more inaccessible Jewish mysticism appeared, the more dangerous it seemed. And the more dangerous it seemed, the more determined the SS became to own it. As the war turned against Germany, the fate of these stolen texts grew increasingly precarious. Bombing raids threatened major cities. Front lines shifted. In response, SS authorities evacuated archives to remote locations. Crates of books were hidden underground, buried in mines, or concealed in fortified buildings. Some collections were lost in transit. Others were deliberately destroyed as the Reich collapsed. But many survived. After 1945, Allied forces uncovered these caches in astonishing condition. Books wrapped carefully in paper. Manuscripts preserved with almost obsessive care. In some cases, Nazi archivists had protected Jewish texts more diligently than they protected human lives. The irony was impossible to ignore. Post-war efforts to return these books were slow and incomplete. Many original owners were dead. Entire communities had vanished. Some texts were repatriated to surviving institutions. Others entered public libraries, museums, or private collections. A portion remains unaccounted for to this day. What endured, however, was the record of the obsession itself. The theft of Jewish sacred texts was not an act of curiosity. It was an act of fear, a fear that the SS never resolved. They believed they were racing against something unseen, a deeper order that outlasted empires, armies, and ideologies. They lost that race. The Reich collapsed in ruins. The SS was dismantled. Its leaders fled, were captured, or died. But the texts they tried to master endured, circulating once again among scholars, students, and communities committed to preserving them not as weapons, but as sources of meaning. In the next chapter, we will confront the most disturbing aspect of this story: how the SS's failure to understand Jewish mysticism intensified its brutality, and how fear of the invisible helped justify the destruction of the visible. Because when an ideology cannot control meaning, it turns to annihilation. And that is where belief becomes terror. By the time the war reached its midpoint, something had shifted inside the SS. The initial confidence, the belief that all systems could be mapped, mastered, and absorbed into the machinery of the Reich, began to fracture. The stolen books had yielded no revelations. The symbols refused to align. The hidden laws of reality, which SS ideologues were certain existed, remained stubbornly out of reach. This failure did not weaken belief. It radicalized it. Within the internal culture of the Schutzstaffel, failure was never interpreted as error. It was interpreted as resistance. If Jewish mysticism could not be decoded, then it must be actively concealing itself. If no mechanism of control could be extracted from Kabbalah, then its power must operate on a level beyond ordinary comprehension. In SS logic, this made it more dangerous, not less. As military fortunes declined after 1942, paranoia deepened. Reports circulated within SS circles suggesting that the Reich's setbacks were not merely strategic, but metaphysical. Some officers speculated that Germany had violated forces it did not understand. Others warned that mass killing on an unprecedented scale might provoke a kind of backlash. Not moral judgment, but imbalance, a disturbance in the hidden order of the world. These anxieties never softened policy, they hardened it. The SS response to uncertainty was escalation. If Jewish knowledge could not be controlled, it had to be eradicated entirely, not only physically, but symbolically. This marked a crucial transition, from genocide framed as racial necessity to genocide rationalized as cosmic defense. The language used internally began to change. Jews were no longer described only as biological threats, but as carriers of corrosive influence. Their existence was portrayed as destabilizing, not to the state, but to reality itself. This abstraction made violence easier. Killing became not an act against people, but an attempt to restore order. The irony is that this worldview directly contradicted the evidence before them. The more Jews were stripped of power, property, and life, the more implausible the idea of hidden domination became. And yet the belief persisted, precisely because it could not be tested. An unseen enemy could never be definitively defeated. SS officials who handled confiscated texts began to complain openly about their inability to extract usable principles. Some proposed intensified study. Others argued that understanding was irrelevant, that destruction alone would suffice. A few even suggested that the act of annihilation itself might neutralize whatever metaphysical danger they imagined. This was magical thinking, masquerading as policy. It also reveals a deeper truth about the Nazi mind. The regime's obsession with control made it incapable of accepting limits. The possibility that the universe might not be programmable was intolerable. Rather than abandon the fantasy, the SS chose to push violence to its extreme. In this sense, the Holocaust was not only an industrial crime, it was a metaphysical one, an attempt to impose absolute dominance over meaning, memory, and existence itself. Kabbalah, as misunderstood by the SS, became a mirror. In it, they saw not Jewish belief but their own fear reflected back at them. They imagined a system where symbols ruled reality because they desperately wanted such a system to exist. A universe governed by hidden levers would justify their actions. It would mean they were not murderers, but engineers. They never confronted the possibility that the world does not yield to those who seek to own it. As the Reich approached collapse, the obsession did not fade. Archives were evacuated even as cities burned. Books were hidden even as armies retreated. The SS could abandon territory, allies, and civilians, but not the idea that somewhere, in the stolen pages of an enemy tradition, lay the explanation for their failure. They died without finding it. What remained after 1945 was not evidence of Jewish supernatural power, but evidence of Nazi terror. Terror of meaning they could not dominate, of survival they could not explain, of a tradition that endured without empire, weapons, or conquest. In the final chapter, we will look at what survived this obsession, the books that returned to the world, the myths that collapsed with the SS, and the lesson the Reich refused to learn, that knowledge rooted in humility cannot be stolen by force, because the greatest power the Nazis feared was not hidden magic, it was continuity. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, it left behind ruins, bodies, and archives. Among the last were the stolen books, thousands of volumes packed into crates, hidden in castles, buried in mines, or sealed in basements far from the front lines. As Allied forces advanced, they encountered these caches unexpectedly. Libraries without readers, manuscripts without owners, shelves of knowledge preserved by those who had tried to erase the people who created it. The discovery exposed the final failure of the SS project. The organization that claimed to understand destiny had misjudged the simplest truth. Power rooted in fear cannot outlast power rooted in continuity. The Schutzstaffel had believed it could conquer meaning by owning symbols. But meaning does not reside in possession. It resides in transmission. Post-war investigations revealed the extent of the obsession. Allied archivists documented tens of thousands of Jewish books and manuscripts recovered from Nazi storage sites. Some were returned to surviving communities. Others were placed in libraries and museums, often because no living owners could be identified. Entire intellectual lineages had been wiped out. Teachers, students, families, gone. Yet the texts endured. This endurance dismantled the myth that had driven SS paranoia. Kabbalah did not protect Jews from murder. It did not bend reality to prevent catastrophe. And that fact, in hindsight, reveals the full extent of Nazi delusion. The power the SS feared never existed in the way they imagined. Jewish survival was not the result of supernatural domination, but of memory, learning, and adaptation. Forces far less dramatic and far more resilient. The SS misunderstood this because their worldview could not accommodate survival without control. They believed endurance required force, secrecy, or manipulation. A tradition that survived through study and ethical debate appeared impossible, and therefore suspicious. In the end, the Reich was defeated not by mystical retaliation, but by its own contradictions. It tried to build a universe where everything had an owner, a master, a hierarchy enforced by violence. Such a universe collapses under its own weight. It leaves no room for meaning that cannot be measured, classified, or exploited. The books the Nazis stole now sit on shelves around the world. They are studied openly, debated, argued over, exactly as they were meant to be. They do not promise victory. They do not offer domination. They ask questions. They insist on responsibility. They remind readers that knowledge divorced from humility becomes destruction. The SS never understood that lesson. They searched for hidden levers because they could not accept limits. They feared invisible power because they refused to recognize moral restraint. In their attempt to conquer meaning, they revealed the emptiness at the center of their ideology. What survived was not secret knowledge. What survived was tradition. And what collapsed was the fantasy that reality can be owned by those willing to kill for it. The Reich is gone. The SS is gone. Their archives are dust, but the books remain. Not as weapons, not as spells, but as evidence of a truth the Nazis could not tolerate. That the most enduring power in history is not domination, but continuity.